because I arrived at the very beginning of 1988. I arrived here just a few days after I arrived. Jiang Jingguo, the former president, passed away. People always talk about how great the food is in Taiwan, and the food is good, but I also say there's a lot of bad food in Taiwan too. Taiwanese are still Taiwanese, and I think the things that Taiwanese find important are still the same. Taiwan is also pretty well cut off from the outside world. People are more willing to accept you for who you are, to be your friend, and to treat you as a friend. It was like the worst experience I ever had in my life. But I do remember at first, like the very first summer I was here, I thought I was gonna die. And back then, Mujia was like the middle of nowhere. And my first impression in the taxi coming to town, I started thinking, what am I doing here? So that was my kind of welcome to Taiwan.
嗨，大家好，欢迎来 Welcome to Taiwan。今天我们跑去到台北，跟我们美国朋友聊天。
我是美国来的，没错。
影片开始以前，请不要忘记订阅、按赞、开启小铃铛。
My name is Tim Berge. In Chinese, it's Bai Jianwen. I'm from the States. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. If people have been following the news recently, Minnesota has been in the news a lot recently when you're talking about U.S. news. So currently, I'm the general manager here at ICRT. ICRT is International Community Radio Taipei. We're the only English language broadcast service in Taiwan. And I've been here since 1988. So I was just doing the math quickly, so that's like, 38 years. Because I arrived at the very beginning of 1988. I arrived here just a few days after I arrived. Jiang Jingguo, the former president, passed away. And so I just come to Taiwan. I was in Taipei for a few days, and I went down to southern Taiwan just to take a quick holiday. And I was in Kending, walking around the streets like a dumb idiot. And back then, Kending was really nothing. It's not the way it is today. And all of a sudden, I noticed all the TVs were black and white. And I'm kind of thinking, what's going on? Why is everything black and white? And then I realized a little bit later, someone told me, Jiang Jingguo 走了, So that was my kind of welcome to Taiwan. I remember my friend told me, because I came in late at night on a flight from the States, and they said, just hop in a taxi and you'll go to my parents' house here in Taipei. They lived out in Mujia. And back then, Mujia was like the middle of nowhere. And my first impression in the taxi coming to town, I started thinking, what am I doing here? Because it just seemed to be so foreign and so different. And so once, I had my own life set up about me, then everything seemed to be okay. But I do remember at first, the very first summer I was here, I thought I was going to die. Okay, because where I'm from in the States, it's more the northern part of the country. It gets hot in the summer, but it doesn't get oppressively hot. And it's not humid the way it is here in Taiwan. And so I remember the very first summer here, I lost 10 kilo, just because I couldn't eat. And so I think that was the first thing that was hard for me to get used to. It's just the difference in temperatures and difference in the weather and stuff like that. And it was kind of like when I stumbled upon the radio job, which took about 3 years, then is like when things really just kind of all came together. I'd never done radio or communications, but after I came here, I realized it was something I enjoyed doing. Back then, radio was still a big deal. It was like there was no internet in Taiwan. There was no cable TV, so to speak. There was 3, government-run TV stations. So if you wanted news and information, radio was pretty much the way to get it, especially in English. And if you wanted Western music, radio was the place where you got it too. And if I walked on the street, I even had times when people would hear my voice and they'd go, ICRT. It's like they recognized my voice, especially when I started speaking in Chinese. They kind of, oh, okay. Because I did traffic reports, bilingual traffic reports back then. So it was just kind of fun. And then I really felt like Taiwan is for me. It's just like working here at the radio, and oftentimes people say, 我从小学都在听你的广播. And it's like, okay.
I think most of my viewers.
Yeah, they probably. Yeah. 从小都听, 对.
Yeah. Wow. So 1988, how was Taiwan back then compared to now?
So back in '88, martial law had just been lifted, but there was still, people weren't as willing to always be talking about politics and maybe to be so open about things. I like to think a lot that Taiwan hasn't changed a lot, but it has changed a lot. In other words, Taiwanese are still Taiwanese. And I think the things that Taiwanese find important are still the same. But they're a bit more open now. They're more willing to talk about things, and they're more open to other ideas than maybe before. And maybe in the past it wasn't that they weren't open, but due to the constructs of society, they weren't allowed to express things so openly. Taiwan was also pretty well cut off from the outside world. To leave back in the old days was a difficult thing. It's not like today where people, it's a holiday time. It's like, okay, where are we going? Back then people rarely traveled overseas. It was difficult. And so I think it's just people have gotten more open and more accepting of new ideas.
Okay, let's go back memory lane.
Memory lane, okay, that could be painful. Okay.
Why do you choose to come to Taiwan?
The reason I came to Taiwan, you could say Taiwan probably chose me. I'd been studying Chinese back in the States, back when studying Chinese back in the States was kind of a weird thing to be doing. And I'd spent a year in Hong Kong during my time at college, university. And Hong Kong was very interesting, but back then it was a British colony, so it was a great place to perhaps learn Cantonese, but not learn Mandarin. But still, China hadn't quite opened up back then. And I had some friends who were from Taiwan back in the States, and they said, you just gotta go to Taiwan, because it's so easy in Taiwan. Worst comes to worst, I can be teaching some English to make some money to get by. And at the same time, it's a place where I can naturally pick up and improve my Mandarin.
Back then, Taiwan wasn't so open to foreigners.
Correct.
How were you received by the Taiwanese populace?
I think, Taiwanese have always been very open to outsiders. And I think there's always been a curiosity about, non-Taiwanese. So I think in that regard, they're always very open and always wanting to make friends with foreign friends. And also I had a good friend of mine in university, in college, who he went to Japan. And, he learned he learned Japanese very well, but he always complained that in Japan, you're always an outsider. And I would say in Taiwan, okay, yeah, both you and I, we don't look like your normal Taiwanese. And so we stand out. But I think people are more willing to accept you for who you are, to be your friend, and to treat you as a friend. And, one nice thing maybe about being a foreigner at times is when you do make those little, faux pas, people are a little bit more forgiving for those silly mistakes you make because, okay, it's a foreigner, what do you expect, And, so I think life here is very easy and people are very accepting, and that's what makes it nice.
The time you came here, do we have the McDonald's and the KFC?
When I first came here, I think McDonald's had just first arrived. But even back then, like if you wanted a hamburger and stuff like that, it was kind of a weird thing, forget about pizza, you couldn't get any stuff like that. But what I enjoyed when I first came here is like all over the city. Okay, like in the old days, like there was like 饺子馆, everywhere. But also like just a lot of good small restaurants, 50 NT, you could get some hui fan. It was all really good food, really inexpensive. And like in Taipei, there used to be a lot of small little 小馆子 that had really good food from all over, China and Taiwan. And it was really great food.
So what's your unpopular opinion about Taiwan?
Is people always talk about how great the food is in Taiwan. And the food is good. But I also say there's a lot of bad food in Taiwan too. When I first came here, there was so many great little restaurants all over town. And now a lot of the restaurants, I think they just more kind of go for fads and things like that. It's changing, but you still don't see as much of the interest in finding, interesting food from around the world and really doing it in the way those places do it. And I think that's one area where Taiwan could improve. Even with some of the local food, that more emphasis should be placed on creating quality and innovative food. And the funny thing is I see a lot of this being done outside of Taiwan by Taiwanese. And yes, there are Taiwanese restaurants which are doing that. Don't get me wrong. Don't come yelling at me and screaming at me. But I think there could actually be a lot more of that. Have even better quality food here in Taiwan.
Being here this long, what has Taiwan taught you?
That's a good question. What has Taiwan taught me? I think Taiwan has taught me patience. I would also say that one important lesson I've learned in Taiwan, and especially from some very good friends of mine, they've always reminded me that you can never judge a person by their outward appearances. And that's one thing, like I said, I'd spent a year in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, it's much more of a structured social society than here. And maybe back then it was because it was still a British colony and there was more that kind of class way of looking at things. And so when you met someone, the first thing they would ask is like, what school you went to, where you work, and then right away they kind of realize, okay, are you above me or are you below me? Whereas in Taiwan, you don't really get that. And also in Taiwan, especially when I first came here, you'd go to an event or a reception of some sort, and maybe the person there dressed in the most ordinary way was maybe actually the most wealthy person there. You know, the guy in flip-flops chewing the betel nut, maybe he was the richest man in the room. And so you quickly learn that you can't just judge that, you know, that guy kind of looks a little bit not too cool, that he's not really that cool. He just maybe doesn't care. When I first came here, I often realized that people were willing to give me a chance just by knowing me. I was their friend. They saw maybe I had certain talents or skills, and they were willing to give me a chance. And so it wasn't as much that they always wanted to look at that piece of paper, you know, that diploma. What school did you go to? What degree do you have? Before they would give you a chance. And so that's why I say, you know, in Taiwan has kind of taught me that you need to get to know the person and judge them according to their own skills, and not just according to who they are, who they know, what school they went to, blah, 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 stuff like that.
Yeah. I spoke to a friend of mine. He said, Taiwan is very beautiful, but Taiwanese don't know how to manage Taiwan.
In some ways, you know, things have changed a lot too in just the way people look at their environment. When I first came to Taiwan, you know, you would spend a day out on the street. You'd go home, you'd wipe your face with a cloth, and it would be black, because from all the dirt and soot from the motorcycles and the cars and, you know, the pollution, everything like that. Taiwan is not that way today. People have learned to respect the environment. When I first came here, people would just throw trash anywhere. Okay, you still have litter bugs today, but it's nothing like what it used to be. And I think Taiwanese over the years, they've learned to come to respect their own environment, and they're proud of the beauty of Taiwan, and they want to protect and they want to let the world know that how great Taiwan can be. You know, also like when I first came to Taiwan, you would go to stand in line at the post office, whatever. There was no MRT, then you'd stand in line maybe for a bus. People were always cutting in line. It was terrible. You know, but then when the MRT came and people, you know, they got reminders that, you know, you can't do that, we have to be orderly. You know, today Taiwanese are very good when it comes to standing in line. People are not cutting in line. So I think Taiwan is really, over these years, they're still the same people. Now they better understand how they need to act civilly in a civil society. And I think they take that responsibility seriously, both in how they interact with other people, but also how they interact with their environment around them. Maybe it's not perfect, but I would say that Taiwan is doing a very good job. I've been in Taiwan long enough that people are always, you know, they think how great other countries are. And it's like, yeah, there's good things about other countries, but Taiwan has a lot of good things about itself too. You know, no place is perfect. But overall, I would say Taiwan is a very good place. Sure, there's room for improvement, but so what? And especially you see with a lot of young people, you know, they take a lot of pride in going and doing outdoor activities. You know, when I first came here, you really couldn't even go to the beach. You know, that was considered to be off limits. You know, you never knew if the communists were going to be coming here to Taiwan and invade and stuff like that. You couldn't even take photos on the beach. You know, and that has all changed. People, they go surfing, they go swimming, and people go hiking, they go camping. When I first came here, some friends took me camping. It was like the worst experience I ever had in my life. Because their idea of camping was basically taking everything from home and taking it out to the outdoors. You know, so they want outdoors was just being home, but you were no longer under a roof. But today, you know, people appreciate being outdoors. They appreciate nature. And they appreciate the fact that you should protect that nature.
Yeah, you couldn't believe most of my friends, my Taiwanese friends, I've met them in the mountains.
So are you hiking or something?
Yeah, I've met so many Taiwanese in the mountains, and they've been very helpful. Sometimes I'll go alone and get stuck somewhere, and they'll come and then drag me along and unstuck me.
Right. Well, and you know, along those same lines, it's like whenever I have friends visit me here in Taiwan, and if I send them out for the day, you know, I always tell them, like, don't worry about getting lost. Because if you do get lost, some Taiwanese person is going to come and help you. And even if it's an old lady who can't speak English, she's going to get on her phone and call her grandson who can speak English and come and help you, you know? So they're always willing to help you out. And, you know, especially when they see a foreign friend in distress, they want to help. Yeah. And that's one thing I've always enjoyed about Taiwan compared to a place like Hong Kong. Okay, so Hong Kong was my first experience here in Asia. And Hong Kong to me is like New York City or London. If you have money, it's a great place to live. If you don't have money, okay, it's, you know, and there's kind of like, okay, maybe in New York there's more in between, but like in Hong Kong, it's like, there's like expensive stuff and inexpensive stuff and not much in between. If you don't have a lot of money, you can't get a nice place to live. Taiwan, you can pretty much get by at any income level. Okay, maybe it's not going to be a fancy apartment, but if you're willing to live a little bit outside the main part of the city, you can find a nice apartment at a cheap price. You can always find food that's reasonably priced, inexpensive, in between, or very expensive. So I would say Taiwan is very manageable in that regard. Even if you're not making a lot of money, it's still you can get by and enjoy life, and I would say live comfortably too.
Do you have anything else to tell Taiwanese people?
Taiwanese people, like all people, we need to believe in ourselves and we need to work together to make this a better place. If I spend the rest of my life here in Taiwan, would I be disappointed? No. There's many things I appreciate about Taiwan. And today when I go back to the States, usually after 2 weeks, I want to get on the plane and head back to Taiwan. It's my home. There's people there I know. There's things I appreciate about America, but there's a lot of things which maybe I appreciate about Taiwan more, especially living here so long.
All right, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. This is very interesting.
Your life experience living in Taiwan.
Sure thing.
And hope you continue to enjoy your stay here in Taiwan.
I have been for 38 years. I think I shall for a little bit longer.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kansi ni sokan yo sihuan bu sihuan. Please let us know what part of the video we can improve. And see you in my next video.
都要喜欢啊，要喜欢全部吧。对。
大家好 Your computer deserves the best protection. Don't wait until it's too late. Protect your files, your privacy, and your future with SureSock One. Click the link below in the description to get yours and stay one step ahead of hackers.